I'm Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Today, we're going to look at the Steelers draft plans, but we're going to look at how the past mistakes need to influence their current decisions with this upcoming draft class. That and more of your questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose on your first bet when you sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, more on them later. So I know we've been taking a lot of looks at the draft, and we'll continue to do that. Like, I'm not going to stop doing that, but I wanted to give people a little bit of a reprieve of just talking about this class as a whole and give us a chance to kind of look at what the Steelers situation has been set up by and what could possibly be learned from previous draft mistakes the Steelers have made in recent years, particularly in the last, 7-8-ish seasons where Kevin Colbert, at the end of his tenure, didn't, produce a lot of great, first round picks in his last few drafts. Granted, he produced some legendary ones. We'll get to more on Kevin Colbert later because that's actually going to be more part of the second segment. But instead of focusing on him, let's focus on what the picks were that we can look back at and what did and didn't work and is currently contributing to the Steelers' problems right now. And we'll start further back and work our way to the now as far as those, some of those misses. Let's start back to 2013. And I think this is where we can start. We can use some of these lessons and try to apply them to this class to say, hey, you know what? You learn from this lesson here. Let's try to, we can't apply everything one-to-one. Not every player is like the same, but there are some lessons that might be more universal that kind of say like, hey, you know what, moving forward, if we're going to take a chance on a guy that's like this, it's going to come in the 5th or 6th round instead of the 1st round. So let's go back to, almost, a little more than 10 years ago and the 2013 first round pick, and that was Jarvis Jones. And one of the things about Jarvis Jones was that in college, Jarvis Jones was talked about like he was going to be the best edge rusher. He was going to be all these things. He was going to be this force that's coming off the edge, but he tested terribly at the combine. And the Steelers still picked him anyways because all the people that looked that talked to him or said, oh, he's a great fit. He'll be a great fit in the NFL. He'll really work. He's out of Georgia. And all the testing came back to be absolutely true. He was terrible. He couldn't get off the ball. He couldn't be physical. He wasn't explosive. He didn't have a dog in him. Like there was all sorts of just problems with Jarvis Jones. And so the Steelers after that, I think, placed an emphasis on, hey, let's get the great athletes. Not that they hadn't done it before, because, they had some great athletes before. But if you look at their next few first-round picks, these were guys that tested very well, like Ryan Shazier, who was just a freak of an athlete when they got him in the first round of 2014, and that absolutely worked. Same for Bud Dupri. If you're familiar with what's called the SPARK score, which is a way of combining, kind of like how we do relative athletic scores now when we talk about like a 10.0, 9.5 or whatever their relative athletic score is, when we're combining all their different events and comparing it to everyone else that's in their position in that draft year. Spark score is very similar, and Bud Dupri at the time in 2015, Spark was still kind of new, but he had like the highest Spark score ever, and people were like, whoa, that guy is freakishly athletic, and they applied to, and so they took Bud Dupri. And I'm not one to say I don't think Bud Dupri was a bust. I think that he ended up being a good player, but they ended up just getting like the best edge rusher in football a couple years later, and you couldn't afford to pay both. Not when Bud Dupri was going to get $70+ million from the Falcons at one point, and they kept him as long as they could on the franchise tag, but it didn't work out. So you got Jarvis Jones on the athletic side, and then you got Artie Burns on another side here. And Artie Burns, and we've talked about this before, I think Artie Burns was the classic situation of drafting for need over value, and looking at, oh, hey, this draft class is going to be, what we get Steelers if you have to go and get a corner. Now, granted, if you remember that time, the Steelers were coming off of the 2015 season, going into 2016. Like the Steelers, there were a lot of reasons to believe that team was on the cusp, because that was a year where like the Steelers made it to the playoffs. Le'Veon Bell was out. D'Angelo Williams was out. Antonio Brown was, destroyed by Vontaze Burfict. Ben Roethlisberger was on one shoulder, and they came a fifth-string running back fumbling in a playoff game from beating the eventual Super Bowl champion Denver Broncos. So, like, it was reasonable to see, like, hey, if this team can just hit on that thing that they absolutely need, which was a corner, they could be good enough to go. And they ended up trying to take that shot, and they missed at 25th overall on Artie Burns. And you look back at it. William Jackson III was the guy taken right before him. There was a run on corner earlier. Granted, this wasn't exactly the best cornerback class. You at the very top, you had like Jalen Ramsey, and that was awesome. But like 10th overall was Eli Apple. That didn't work. Neither did Vernon Hargreaves, or and William Jackson III, was solid, but first round pick. He's already not playing for the Bengals anymore. So, this ended up not working out. And granted, like after that, you did have like Xavier Howard in the second round, but a lot of people didn't look at Xavier Howard. Why? Because he wasn't exactly he wasn't put up there as high. But let's you look at Artie Burns, and that was a situation where the Steelers, if they had sat there and said, okay, let's draft for value, and I think that most Steelers analysts and people that were running the team admitted at the time, like, hey, like they could have gone after, like, say, a Kenny Clark, who became a very good defensive tackle for the Packers. And granted, the Steelers kind of they already had Hayward and they had Tuitt, and that was part of their long-term plan. And in fact, later in this draft, they went and got Javon Hargrave in the third round, who was also pretty good. So it wasn't like they heavily needed. But if they had drafted for value, maybe you avoid the situation with Artie Burns. So that's another lesson to take with you. Now, the Steelers absolutely hitting TJ Watt. So there's, that's just that was a home run pick. But Terrell Edmunds is a peculiar case, because he absolutely was a bust for a first round pick, but he was at least a solid contributor who helped your team for about 5 years or so when he was on the team. And I think the biggest thing was, if you're going to draft a safety in the first round, you need a ball production safety. Terrell Edmunds wasn't that in college. He was very much he was, again, like more of the athletic freak, like they were trying to draft in the middle 2010s. A guy who ran really well, was very explosive, had the right kind of size, and that's all good and well, but you need a guy who shows that, hey, he can do all that and be an amazing playmaker with the ball in his hands if you're going to go get attacking the ball, if you're going to be in the secondary. And that was just something they didn't have. Devin Bush is a very unique case, I think, because of his injury situation, but certainly he's a bust. There's no doubt about it. It's just, you go back to his first year and a half with the Steelers, he was being very much the linebacker that they wanted to have ever since they lost Ryan Shazier to his terrible injury. But I think some people wonder, like, did the drafting an undersized linebacker that high and trading up to get him, was that a mistake? Again, drafting for need and going and placing way too much value in the need to get an inside linebacker. And again, it was in a time where the Steelers, coming off of 2018, yes, they missed the playoffs that season, but that was a year where Ben Roethlisberger, I think, threw for the most yards in the NFL, or most touchdowns in the NFL. He also led the NFL interceptions, but it was like, okay, they project to have Antonio Brown back. They project, they've moved on from Le'Veon Bell at this point, but they have options before. Actually, no, this was after Antonio Brown left, but they still had Ben Roethlisberger. They had no idea that he was about to throw his shoulder, his elbow out, and there was a whole lot of reasons to believe. But again, placing a little bit too much value in the position, or drafting a little above the actual value, that led to problems. So you could do that, and you could go to Kenny Pickett and say, like, hey, they clearly missed on quarterback. But I think what you're seeing across the board here is the Steelers need to stick to what Omar Khan, I think, has kind of prioritized, at least in his early iterations of things. Omar Khan's only had one draft, and everyone's in love with the draft, and reasonably so. It was a good, these guys produced well. Broderick Jones played well. Joey Porter Jr. played well. Keanu Benton played well. Nick Herbig played well. Darnell Washington was a good contributor. Like all those things worked out for this draft class. But that doesn't always happen, even with the best ones. Like if you go through Kevin Colbert's career, he had some bangers throughout his career. And we'll talk more about Kevin Colbert on the next after this next break here. But I think the biggest thing, though, that you're seeing the Steelers is they're trying to make sure that they value guys the right way and for the right reasons. They're not trying to go in and saying, hey, we really think this guy can just be the guy because we've heard that he fits well. They got to test well. They have to be at the right position. They're not gonna they need to not overdraft positions anymore for things that that shouldn't be as valued as high as first round picks. And that's part of why we talk about the center position and saying like, hey, unless this guy's like the super all pro next coming of Marquise Pouncey, Dermontti Dawson, whatever, like centers aren't first round picks. This is why we keep talking about other positions being potentially first round picks. And that's another topic for another day. But I think applying all those things, you want the guys that are testing well. You want the guys that are the right size for their position. You want the right positions that are worth the first round picks. And you want, when you get a guy that's going to be making plays on the ball, whether it's a receiver or a DB, you want players that have shown they can do at least that. And that's where you avoid a Terrell Edmunds situation. And I think applying the mix of those. So far, Omar Khan has done a decent job reassembling the roster, and I think he is applying a lot of the lessons they learned. And these aren't all the lessons. These are just some things that we're just taking observations from each of these draft misses. But I think that if you look at this draft class and some of the players in it, we've talked about different guys who have tested well, who have looked the part, who have measured well, who have good tape, who and are the right size, the right build for what you want. Those are the guys, and also the right positions. Again, drafting the right position for position of value and not overdrafting a player simply because of your needs on the roster, which again is what the Steelers might run into if they draft a center too high in this draft. They do need to get a center, and centers are very important, and they need it for their offense, but doing it at the right time will be the key. And I think that's another lesson that you can learn from the Steelers' past mistakes. But we got some of your questions, and some of the questions involve those Steelers' past mistakes. We'll address that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. It's playoff time in the NBA and the NHL, and baseball is in full swing. That makes FanDuel your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed with your first bet, win or lose. That's $150 to use on point spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and you'll make your first bet an automatic win. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon for new customers to get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed, win or lose with your first bet when you sign up on FanDuel, and that's FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. Before we get to take some more of the calls that we went, I want to just continue just to finish my point here about the Steelers draft misses. It is always important to remember there are merits to a lot of draft picks. There's a lot of times that everything lines up. Like when I remember covering the Devin Bush draft pick live and everyone thinking like the Steelers did it. They went and got the guy. And again, when he played his first year and a half, he looked like the guy, but sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes injuries happen. Sometimes chaos happens. Sometimes a person's just a jerk and you didn't know that. I think that's what they went through with like Chase Claypool and guys like that. So, there's certainly situations where you can't always be right about everything. That's why no one hits 100% of the time in the draft. But I think that's where you're seeing a refocus by Omar Khan, Andy Weidel in this front office. They're having a lot of overturn. They had a lot of overturn in their front office. A lot of new scouts. They've kept some from the old guard, but I think you're seeing them refocus on how to make sure that they're hitting in the draft and not making the same mistakes that they did, especially in the 2010s that led up to the current situation they have, where they still have several holes on their roster. And with that, we're going to go to the phone lines here, because as always, you could call into this show if you want to get your question on the show at 412-223-6644. Call us, leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute, and we'll try to get you on the show. This question comes from Doc, all the way out in Caliente, Nevada. Again, Steelers Nation is everywhere. Here's Doc's question, and it's kind of relevant to this discussion.
Hey, Chris, I love the show. This is Doc from Caliente, Nevada. Got to go to my first Steelers game this year in Pittsburgh. In my whole life, I loved it. I just had a question for you. Do you think that Colbert retired too late? Like, should we have benefited of having Omar Khan 1 year earlier? I do believe that. I see a lot of people that we passed on an earlier draft in the playoffs right now, and I feel like we made some really poor choices. So I wanted to ask you that.
So thank you, Doc, for your question. And you're right, there were some poor choices, and we just talked about some of those poor choices, the misses that they had there. But to answer your question about did they hold on to Kevin Colbert too long? Yeah, you could say that now objectively, like, hey, things weren't working out, and now you're getting Omar Khan in there, and things are going well. But I think it's also important to remember Omar Khan is, his specialty has always been the books. His specialty has been, he learned behind Kevin Colbert, and he was able to study what he did for years. And now they brought in Andy Weidel, who's also teaming up with him. So it's not just Omar Khan; it's the two of them working together and putting things in front of the assignments and trying to set up this front office for its future. I think that was not always present for the Steelers in the Kevin Colbert era, and I also think it's important to remember that, like, sometimes you need to give your front office grace when they make mistakes, because they're going to make mistakes. Every front office misses at times, and it was very difficult, I think, until like 2023 or even like this offseason, until we look back and said, man, those last several drafts that Kevin Colbert had were not all that great. And there's some picks that I think you could say are still out there proving who they are. But when you look at, the fact that Kenny Pickett's not with the team anymore and how that played out, you look at Chase Claypool in the second round, you look at, Devin Bush's injury and how that led to him being off the team, Terrell Edmunds not working out. That's a lot of first round draft picks and early in the first picks that they had in the draft that didn't work out in that span. Now, here's the problem with just saying, oh yeah, hindsight of 2020, we should have just done that. The Steelers should just should have gotten rid of Kevin Colbert as soon as he made one or two mistakes. No one knew that Devin Bush was a mistake until like 2021, 2022, when he came back from injury. And then when everyone's like, oh, he's not the same guy that he was before his injury. Terrell Edmunds was a developmental piece. It took until I'd say like 2020, 2021 as well, before you saw like, okay, maybe he's not a first round guy. Chase Claypool, when he came into the league in 2020, he was on fire. I think he had like a 10 touchdown season in his rookie year. There was no way to tell that he wasn't going to be a thing until 2022 when they got rid of him. I'm not going to sit here and say that Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth are busts. I think that they've been good players and they continue to be good players, and I think they work. But Kenny Pickett, there was no way to know that didn't work until now. And I think that there's some people sitting there like, okay, yeah, but they're still busts. Why didn't they just get rid of him after other mistakes? What about like Artie Burns? What about Jarvis Jones? You mentioned those earlier. Okay, but look at the players that were picked around those guys. Yes, those guys were busts, but if you look at a 5-year span, with Jarvis Jones being like the year in the middle, with 2 years in front and 2 years behind, the 2 first-round picks that came before Jarvis Jones were David DeCastro and Cam Hayward. And if you want to even go back even further, Marquise Pouncey. The 2 first-round picks that came after Jarvis Jones were Ryan Shazier and Bud Dupri. So, like, in that span, Colbert missed one time there. And so this is also a guy who, coming off the 2000s, the Steelers had his 2 Super Bowl rings. He drafted Casey Hampton, drafted Troy Polamalu, drafted Ben Roethlisberger, Heath Miller, Bryant McFadden, Santonio Holmes, Lawrence Timmons, all these guys that hit. And some people I say, what about like, when they drafted Rashard Mendenhall and Lyman Sweet and Ziggy Hood? None of those guys worked. Yeah, they didn't. But then the very next year they drafted Marquise Pouncey, Emmanuel Sanders, and like they put things together. And oh, by the way, a guy named Antonio Brown, who became like the best receiver in football for a decade. So like there was not a time where if you were being objective about Kevin Colbert that you could say, this guy's cooked. This guy is just done, unless you were saying I have an intuition, or I just have a feeling. But there was very few times where you could say like, oh, this was definitely over, because a lot of the times we were still evaluating who these players were and who they were going to be. So did they keep him too long? Yes, but it's part of the risk you run when you have a Hall of Famer at a position like GM, and Kevin Colbert, mark my words, is going to go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You go back to, all the picks that he had that built up that, again, Troy Polamalu and Ben Roethlisberger in back-to-back years, you don't get rid of the guy who did that, right? Like you let him cook and you let him keep working. And again, he helped build another team that became, a power in the NFL. But I say all that to say, Doc, your question, it's not that it's a good question. When would this have happened? If the Steelers would have moved on, maybe after 2021, maybe something would have been seen there as far as how they could have maneuvered to get a different quarterback situation, or how they would work with that. But I think the big thing here about, again, starting off the show with talking about what to learn from there is that Kevin Colbert's process overall still worked. They just took some bad shots at the end of his career. But Omar Khan has the opportunity to look at the parts that did work and look at the parts that didn't work and apply them. And at least in the first draft, that's exactly what he did. He took what they knew, he applied them the way that he could, and they were able to land a draft class that had a very significant contribution to their rookie season. So I think that's. Yes, they kept Kevin Colbert too long, but you look at the production, it makes sense that they gave him a shot to prove it, and it still worked out. It gave them something, as far as the guys that they were able to send. Like if you get rid of him before the late 2010s because you were upset about Artie Burns or whatever, you miss out on TJ Watt, and where would the Steelers be without TJ Watt and his sack numbers? I think that's part of his legacy just as much as the bad finish is. So should they have gotten rid of him? Sure, but there was no way to know that until it was too late. And that's part of the GM business, part of the football business. And I think that's where something has to be kept track of there. But we got another topic that's going to come from a question from you on. It's about Najee Harris and his future with the team. We'll address that here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our discussion on the Pittsburgh Steelers here. And this is a question that I think some people have pondered a little bit, but Clinton all the way from Mississippi asked, and it's kind of a relevant question because of deadlines coming up. Here's Clinton with his question.
Yes, this is Clinton Panel from Ripley, Mississippi. I am wondering, what's the Steelers going to do with Harris at running back? Are they going to try to sign him before the season starts, or let him have a good year, run over everybody, and then cost us a lot more money at the end of this football season? I know it would be better if we could sign him before the season starts. What's your thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you, Clinton. And as always, you can call in like all of our guests that have been on this show today asking questions at 412-223-6644. All right, so let's dive into the Najee Harris situation. First of all, it wouldn't just be a regular old extension that Najee probably signed. He probably signed the 5th-year extension, which is the natural part of his contract because it's, he's a first-round rookie or a first rounder on a rookie deal, and it is time to decide that. Now, I will say this. The Steelers are cutting it close if they wanted to extend him moving forward, and that's simply because the deadline is May 2nd. So, like, as soon as this draft's over, they're going to have to make a decision on this. But will they, decide to keep Najee Harris? Personally, I think they will. It just makes a lot of sense to keep a veteran running back that with his kind of production and how they plan to grow this team moving forward. As far as what they want to do with the run game and how they want to run the ball and balance that with the pass and make things easier on both sides. And Najee Harris is a part of that. Him and Jaylen Warren, a 1-2 punch. It's not just a one-man show in either direction. Both are dangerous, and together I think that they recognize that, and that's something they want to tap into. Now, someone's probably saying, okay, Chris, all that sounds fine and dandy, but like, how much money is Najee Harris going to command? And the truth is, not that much. According to overthecap.com, when you go and look at a 5th-year extension for Najee Harris next year, it's $6.79 million. So, like, that's not a whole lot, especially when you look at the Steelers cap situation. I know that people are traditionally used to just the Steelers just having the worst salary cap situation of all time because of just, they had Ben Roethlisberger for the longest time, and they kept him, and they kept a lot of veterans. So oftentimes the Steelers salary cap space was just not there because they were paying so many of the players they drafted. But next year, after everything's said and done here, next year their current team cap space is $96.3 million. And if you can afford to keep a veteran running back who knows your team, can be a leader, can be a person at the point of attack of an offense that you're trying to put together, it makes a lot of sense. I look at how the idea of keeping Najee Harris works. And if you didn't keep Najee Harris, let's say you didn't sign him to a 5th-year extension, he played the year out, and then you try to resign. If he has a great year, you try to resign him. But if you try to resign him at that point, then you're in competition, and also you've created, there's not a guarantee that he wants to come back there. And to some people, that might be fine because there's some people that don't like Najee Harris. But to me, I think that he's a big part of what the Steelers are trying to do right now. I think that this is kind of his time. This is kind of what I've been saying, for a while now about like Derrick Henry, got Arthur Smith, and then he had the 2 best years of his career. I'm not saying that that Najee Harris is Derrick Henry or the exact thing's going to happen, but the opportunity to make it happen is there. And if the Steelers are smart, I think they give him a 5th-year extension and they see how he plays this year and then going in next. And then when they want to make renegotiate and do a whole new contract, you cross that road when you get there. But right now, the Steelers are setting themselves up with an opportunity to have an experienced backfield in the part of the offense that can be really creative moving forward and trying to get their running backs in different spots. Let them catch the ball more. Let them catch the ball more in space. Get them in space, period. And I think that that's where the Steelers' focus, offensively is going to be, is trying to make those types of things happen. And Najee Harris, he's a guy who protects the ball. He's physical. He throws people off of him. He adds up to being, one of those guys that you can keep around. And again, $6.79 million, nothing. I mean, at that point, I'm looking at the numbers here now. I think that they would, the Steelers, if they signed Najee Harris to that in 2025, they'd have like, still 89 something million dollars in cap space. Like they're good. They're in a good situation. So all that's simply to be said. I just think that Najee Harris, signing him to a 5th-year extension makes sense. If you don't think it makes sense because you don't think that he's that good, that's fine too. But I think if you look at what they need and how him and Jaylen Warren as a 1-2 punch can really help whoever it is, Russell Wilson or Justin Fields, makes sense to go get to make sure that he's at least around 1 more year. And then later you can decide whether or not he's the franchise running back that you keep around for like a 3 to 4 year deal. But I think the Steelers just need to keep working that situation. I'm your host, Chris Carter. This has been the Locked On Steelers podcast on a Wednesday. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, here talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers. Back tomorrow with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.